All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're diving into a source that really challenges the way we typically talk about American slavery. It argues for a much more complex and, frankly, a more global view of this part of our history.
Wow. Okay, so the source material does not pull any punches. It kicks things off with this incredibly provocative claim, basically saying that our whole idea of who the villains are in the story of slavery has been turned completely upside down. It's a statement designed to make you stop and think, and it really sets the stage for the entire argument we're about to unpack.
So, what's the main idea here? Well, the source argues that to really get a handle on this history, we have to move past what it calls a cartoonish caricature. The thinking is that our common understanding has been boiled down to a simple good guys versus bad guys story, and that this actually stops us from having a more meaningful conversation about the past. So, here's how we're going to break down this argument. We'll follow the source's logic through these 6 key points. We'll start with this idea of a cartoonish history, then widen the lens to look beyond the South, zoom out to the global context, examine the abolition movement, take another look at the Civil War, and finally, wrap up with why any of this matters today. Okay, so what does the source really mean by a cartoonish history? Well, the core idea it presents is that, weirdly enough, the more time that passes, the less objective we seem to get about certain events. The argument goes that instead of gaining perspective and nuance, we've actually simplified these histories into these very black and white good versus evil narratives. So, to start chipping away at this cartoonish view, the source first wants to broaden the map. It argues that the idea of pinning slavery only on the American South is, and I'm quoting here, totally absurd. And the first point it makes is all about the North's deep economic connection to slavery. It really emphasizes that it wasn't just about a few individuals owning slaves. The whole massive, profitable machinery of the slave trade itself was largely run out of northern ports, which means the entire region's economy was tied into it. And to back this up, the source throws out some pretty startling numbers. Let's start with New York City. It claims that at one point, a staggering 42%, that's almost half of all households in the city, were slave-owning households. Then it shifts over to Connecticut. Here, the source points out that among the most educated and respected people in society, we're talking ministers, lawyers, public officials, a full 50% owned slaves. It was woven right into the state's leadership. And to really hammer home the point about scale, even in one of the smallest states, Rhode Island, the source claims that 1 out of every 14 people was enslaved. This shows it was anything but a minor issue in New England. All right, so after looking at the North, the source just zooms way out, dramatically. It argues that to really put American slavery into context, we first have to see it as just one piece of a much, much bigger story, a story that's nearly as old as humanity itself. And the key idea here, according to the source, is that for pretty much all of human history, slavery wasn't even a moral question. It points out that all these different cultures, separated by huge distances and thousands of years, all practiced it. It was, for better or worse, a grim, universal part of the human experience. Now, putting slavery in this global context of being totally accepted everywhere leads directly to what the source says is the biggest and most important irony of the whole story. And here it is. This is really the core claim the source is making. What made Western culture unique in history wasn't that it participated in slavery, because everyone did, but that it was the first culture to create a widespread, powerful, and principled movement to get rid of it completely. This timeline really lays out the whole argument visually, and it's pretty stark when you see it like this. It shows these thousands of years where slavery was just a fact of life globally. And then you see this tiny sliver of time, starting in the 1800s, where this abolition movement, which the source says was Western-led, takes hold and then spreads across the world over the next couple of centuries. Okay, now the source pivots to a really specific moment in American history, the Civil War, and it takes a hard look at the timing and the real motivation behind Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So the source argues that the proclamation was carefully timed. It didn't happen until well into the war, and it was even more carefully worded. It was written specifically so it would not free slaves in any of the territories that Lincoln actually controlled. The source presents this not as some kind of moral failure, but as proof that it was a genius political move, a strategic play to redefine the war and, crucially, to keep European powers from jumping in on the side of the South. All right, so that brings us to the big question, right? Why does any of this actually matter today? I mean, why bother digging into all these complicated details about a story that seems so morally straightforward?
Well, the argument is that this cartoonish view of history leads to something the writer C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. It's that feeling we get when we look back at people in the past and think, wow, we're so much smarter and more moral than they were. The source says that this attitude actually prevents us from learning the real, messy lessons from their struggles. So instead of just feeling resentment, the source argues that a more accurate and contextualized history can actually lead to some really important virtues. It suggests this kind of perspective gives us humility about our own time, gratitude for how far we've come, and maybe a wiser, more thoughtful approach to justice today. And that's where the source leaves us, with this really powerful final question. Is our history just a simple story of heroes and villains that we use to make ourselves feel good today? Or is it something more complicated, more difficult, but ultimately more useful? According to this source, how you answer that question has a direct impact on how you think about justice right here, right now.